My children always saw me as convenient, quiet. When I helped with their kids, cleaned their house, cooked their dinners, I heard their whispers behind my back. They thought I was too old to catch the hints, too weak to defend myself. And then one day, at lunch, my son's wife smirked and said, "Just sit, knit, and stay quiet." I smiled, placed my needles gently in my lap, and said nothing. That same night, while the whole house slept, I took out a box of documents, and I started knitting her something else. Not a scarf, not a sweater, and when she opened the envelope the next morning, the smile froze on her face. Because sometimes the hardest blows come from the ones you're used to treating as background. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. When I first moved into their home in Tacoma, Washington, it was early spring, the kind where rain fell lightly in the mornings and left everything smelling like wet bark and moss. The kind where you told yourself the cold wasn't really cold, just something temporary you could shake off with a thicker sweater and a hot cup of tea. I had packed my life into 9 cardboard boxes and a suitcase, and my son Mark helped carry them up the driveway like it was no big deal. I told him not to strain himself. He told me not to be silly, but still, I saw how he avoided meeting my eyes. They'd offered me the room on the first floor, the one that used to be an office before the kids were born. It was small, but it had a window that faced the garden. In the mornings, the light came in at an angle that made everything feel soft and half-remembered. I put my knitting basket next to the armchair in the corner and hung my late husband's framed photograph on the wall. It was enough. I didn't need much. The plan, as Mark explained it, was that I would stay for a while, just until I figured out what came next. After Harold died, the house back in Spokane had become too quiet, too big, too full of echoes and reminders. And when the property taxes went up again, I told myself it was time. Mark offered, I accepted. It all happened faster than I expected, like most decisions that follow loss. Clara, his wife, was pleasant at first, always polite. She thanked me for helping with the kids, smiled when I folded the laundry, complimented my cooking when I made her mother's chili recipe from memory. But even in those early weeks, I could feel the invisible boundary she never let me cross. Everything I did was appreciated, but never invited. She managed her home like a carefully choreographed performance, and I had entered stage left without a script. The kitchen became my place, by default more than agreement. I didn't assert myself. I simply filled in the spaces they left open. When breakfast dishes were left in the sink, I washed them. When the baby cried in the night, I rocked him. When Clara forgot to take the laundry out of the dryer, I folded it into neat, warm stacks and left them on the stairs. I told myself I was helping, that I was being useful, that it mattered. But gradually, the lines blurred. My hands were in everything, yet I was nowhere. Clara never criticized me directly. She didn't need to. Her silences did the work. The way she rearranged the dishwasher after I had already loaded it. The way she reworded what I said to the children, correcting me with a smile so wide it felt like being smothered. I learned quickly that compliments were often warnings, and silence was a door closing. The kids were the only ones who didn't wear masks. They loved me without hesitation. Nora, 6 years old, always crawled into my lap with a book after dinner. Leo, barely 2, followed me around with sticky hands and unspoken trust. With them, I felt seen. I felt needed. But adults had learned how to ignore you with kindness. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was sitting at the edge of the kitchen table sorting through green beans with a bowl in my lap. Clara was on a work call, pacing in the dining room with her headset in, her voice calm and clipped. I could hear every third word: strategy, alignment, metrics. Her life was built from words like those. Mine had been built on smaller, softer ones. Mark came home that evening late, tired, distracted. He kissed Clara on the cheek, gave me a half hug, and turned on the TV for the kids. We ate dinner together, all 5 of us, but it felt like a table divided by more than just plates. When I tried to mention something I'd read in the newspaper, an article about elder care funding, no one responded. I let the sentence hang there until it dissolved into the clinking of forks. Afterward, Clara cleared the table without asking for help. I offered anyway. She said it was fine. I went back to my chair in the corner and picked up my knitting. My hands moved on their own, the yarn soft and familiar. I had knit for decades. Blankets, hats, scarves, sweaters. I knit through grief, through boredom, through joy. But that evening, it felt different. Like I was knitting, not for warmth or purpose, but to fill a space that had no shape, a space that was slowly swallowing my voice. I didn't say anything when they turned the living room lights low. I didn't say anything when Clara closed the kitchen door behind her. I just sat there, at the edge of the kitchen, half in, half out. That night, in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how easy it is to become a background character in your own life. I wondered how many women had found themselves like this, tucked into corners, thanked but not included, visible but not heard. And I wondered what it would take to change that. I didn't know the answer yet, but I would. It was a Sunday afternoon in late May, the kind where the sun came in bright streaks through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. The air smelled like lemon wood polish and garlic from the roast I had started earlier that morning. I had spent most of the day in the kitchen, moving between the stove, the counter, and the dining table. It was Nora's birthday, and Clara had invited a handful of their neighbors and friends, people I barely knew, people who barely looked my way unless I was holding a tray of something warm. The living room had been decorated with pastel balloons and gold foil streamers. The dining table was set with matching plates and napkins that Clara had ordered online. Everything looked perfect. Everything always did when she planned an event. She had a way of controlling every detail as if her identity depended on it. I kept my head down and did what I always did. I helped. I stayed in the kitchen, refilling the lemonade, keeping the counters clean, making sure the appetizers didn't run out. When the doorbell rang and the guests began arriving, Clara greeted them with wide arms and practiced laughter, her voice rising in pitch just slightly, a melody of charm and presentation. No one asked who had made the spinach quiche, or the strawberry shortcake, or the delicate cucumber sandwiches cut into perfect squares. I didn't expect them to. That wasn't why I had made them. I did it because I thought it mattered. I stayed mostly behind the scenes, slipping in and out of rooms like a house ghost. The children ran around screaming, high on sugar and freedom. I smiled when Nora hugged me in passing, her face flushed from the sun and excitement. That was the only thank you I needed. It happened sometime after the cake. The party had spilled into the backyard, and I had stepped outside with a fresh tray of fruit skewers. Clara was standing near the patio table with 3 of the other mothers, young, polished women with smooth hair, manicured nails, and designer sunglasses perched on their heads. They were laughing about something. I didn't mean to interrupt. I simply offered the tray. Clara glanced at me, barely lifting her head. She smiled, but it wasn't real. It was the kind of smile people give to store clerks and mail carriers. Polite, dismissive, transactional. One of the women complimented the fruit presentation. Clara made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, then turned back to me and said the words I wouldn't forget. "Why don't you just sit and knit, Mom? Everything's handled." The way she said it, sweet and sharp in the same breath, felt like a slap dressed in lace. I froze for a moment, tray still in my hands as the words settled into the air between us. She didn't say it angrily. That would have been easier in a way. It was the softness of her tone that made it worse. The way she used Mom like placeholder, a prop in her perfect afternoon. The other women chuckled politely. One of them even said, "I wish my mother-in-law could knit," as if I were some antique hobbyist trotted out for decoration. I nodded as if I agreed. I set the tray down on the side table. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I didn't even let my face change. Years of holding my expression in courtrooms had taught me how to stay neutral when everything inside was boiling. I turned and walked back into the house. The air indoors was cooler, quieter. I returned to the kitchen and began wiping down the counter even though it was already clean. My hands moved out of habit. My mind, however, wasn't still. It repeated her words again and again, each time stripping them of any pretense. "Why don't you just sit and knit? Just sit and knit, stay quiet, be harmless, be useful, but not seen, not heard, not remembered." I went to my room, closed the door softly, and sat down in the armchair by the window. My knitting bag was there, tucked neatly beside it. I reached for the needles, pulled out the yarn, and began to knit. Not because she had told me to, but because I needed the movement. I needed something for my hands to do while my heart processed the coldness that had just been dressed in sweetness. Outside the window, I could hear the faint sounds of laughter and small talk. The party continued as if I'd never been part of it. I didn't cry. I didn't stew in anger. What I felt was something quieter, a shift, a clarity, like a door that had always been slightly ajar had finally swung wide open. This wasn't about knitting. This wasn't about fruit skewers or quiches or birthday parties. This was about being told, with a smile, that my voice no longer belonged, that I had overstayed my usefulness, that I was a prop in someone else's story. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had written plenty of stories of my own. I had built a career on careful language, on words that changed outcomes, on precision and consequence. I had not lost that. I had simply set it down for a while. Now, sitting in that chair, the yarn warm in my lap, I began knitting something else entirely. Not a shawl, not a hat, not a gift, but an idea. And it was growing stitch by stitch. The house settled into its usual hush around 10:30 that night. I could hear the upstairs water pipes whine briefly, then go still. The television clicked off with a final hum, and soft footsteps padded down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The children's voices had faded hours earlier, their laughter long since absorbed into the walls and the furniture. I waited in my room, lights off, sitting upright in bed with the weight of my own breath pressing against the silence. Tacoma was never truly dark, not even in the quiet neighborhoods. A dim orange glow from the street lamps always managed to find its way through the curtains, casting long shadows on the ceiling. I watched them move with the rhythm of passing cars. This was a city where the silence didn't comfort. It asked questions. I had always been a light sleeper, and that night, sleep wouldn't come. Not after the way she spoke to me, not after the way her voice cut through the daylight like silk over steel. I replayed it in my mind, not because I wanted to, but because my thoughts had become trapped in it. The exact phrasing, the tone, the smirk, the polite cruelty wrapped in sunshine. I had heard those kinds of words before, long ago in courtrooms and behind office doors. I used to fight against them. And now, Here I was again, only older, quieter, no longer armed with the confidence of my younger years, but still capable of understanding exactly what I'd heard. I rose from bed and wrapped myself in a thick sweater. The house was cold in that kind of intimate way that comes only after everyone else has gone to sleep. I stepped barefoot down the hallway, passing framed photos of smiling vacations and carefully posed milestones. I moved slowly, deliberately, like I didn't want the floor to know I was walking on it. The kitchen was dark except for the moonlight slipping in through the window above the sink. It turned the countertops into glass and the cabinets into silhouettes. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew this house well enough by now, knew every drawer that stuck, every cabinet that creaked. I moved to the corner and opened the old cedar box I had kept tucked behind the pantry shelf. Inside were files, not just old photographs or sentimental cards, but documents, legal ones, proof of things no one in this house seemed to remember. I carried the box to the table and opened it carefully. My fingers moved over the familiar edges. My degree still crisp behind a plastic sheet, the bar license, past property deeds, a copy of my will, a document from the sale of our old home, and the bank statement that proved the money I'd transferred to Mark and Clara when they needed help with the down payment on this house. They had thanked me then, sincerely. That was before they began treating me like a couch throw. I pulled out a yellow notepad and a pen, old tools, reliable ones. I began to write, not with rage, not with sadness, but with precision. I drafted a summary of the money I'd contributed since moving in, rent, groceries, childcare. I calculated the hours I spent doing things no one paid attention to, hours of labor invisible to anyone not looking closely. I didn't do it for drama. I did it because I needed to see it myself, to remind myself that I hadn't imagined it all. Somewhere upstairs, the old radiator kicked on with a groan. Pipes rattled softly, then quieted again. I kept writing. When I finished, I looked at what I had written and realized it was the beginning of something larger. Not a confrontation, not yet, but a line drawn. A line only I could see for now, but one that, once crossed, would change everything. I folded the documents back into the box and tucked it away again. As I slid it into place, I noticed a photograph tucked between two file folders. It was from my first year in practice, me standing in front of a courthouse in Olympia, holding a file and smiling at something just beyond the camera. My hair was darker then, my shoulders straighter, but my eyes looked the same. Sharp, calm, certain. I took the photo and brought it back to my room. I placed it on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it. Not to remember who I had been, but to recognize that she was still there. Back under the covers, I let the weight of the evening settle across me. My hands still smelled faintly of lemon soap and ink. I lay still, eyes open, listening to the slow rhythm of the sleeping house. They all believed I was harmless now, soft, retired, redundant, but they had mistaken my silence for surrender, and in that quiet I had started to remember the sound of my own power. The next morning arrived shrouded in fog, and the world outside the window looked like it had been erased and redrawn in pale grays and whites. I woke earlier than usual before the sounds of the children's feet thundered across the upstairs hallway and before the coffee pot sputtered to life in the kitchen. The house was still asleep. I sat in bed for a while, unmoving, watching the light push against the curtain, thinking only one thing: today was the day I would write it. I dressed slowly. A heavy cardigan, thick wool socks, the soft jeans I wore when I wanted to feel anchored. I didn't braid my hair like I usually did. I tied it back and tucked it behind my ears. My hands trembled a little from the cold, or maybe from something deeper than that, something under the surface I didn't want to name. Downstairs, I moved soundlessly. I brewed tea instead of coffee, letting the steam warm my face as I carried the mug to the kitchen table. The same table where I'd sat through family dinners and birthday parties. Through silences I had bitten my tongue to preserve. The same table where I'd watched them forget I had a voice. I brought out the cedar box again and laid it gently on the table. One by one, I pulled out the documents I had organized the night before. I lined them up like chess pieces, each one a move I hadn't made until now. The deed, the financial contributions, the quiet receipts of everything I had given and everything they had ignored. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up in the dim kitchen light, casting a faint glow across the wood grain of the table. I opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. It waited for me with perfect patience, unaware of the wait that would follow. I began the letter formally. Full names, full addresses, proper formatting. This wasn't going to be a plea or an emotional outburst. This was going to be a record, a statement, a line in the sand. I addressed it to both Mark and Clara. I explained point by point the financial arrangement I had helped create for them when they bought the house. How I had contributed not only money, but time, care, and unpaid labor. I listed the hours I spent each week with the children, the meals, the cleaning, the errands. I calculated what that labor would cost if they had paid someone else for it. I listed those numbers, not to punish, but to quantify. I detailed the ownership terms we had once agreed on. I reminded them that the house was not solely theirs, that I still legally owned a significant portion of the property, that if I chose to exercise my rights, I had every legal avenue to do so. And then I gave them a choice. Either they could buy out my share of the house at the current market rate within 60 days, or I would begin proceedings to sell my portion, forcing a sale of the entire property. I wasn't asking. I wasn't warning. I was informing. I ended the letter with a single sentence that I rewrote 3 times before it felt right. Respect, like space, must be shared or reclaimed. I saved the file, printed 2 copies, and signed both in blue ink. My name looked smaller on the page than I remembered it being, but no less sharp. I folded each letter into a plain white envelope and sealed them. No return address, just their names, written in my careful handwriting. I called the courier service before they woke up. Scheduled a same-day delivery. I didn't want to hand the letters to them myself. That would make it personal, emotional. This wasn't personal anymore. It was practical. I had spent enough years managing other people's emotions. This letter was the first thing I had done purely for myself in a long time. After the call, I poured a fresh cup of tea and stood at the window. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the outlines of trees and rooftops. It reminded me of how truth slowly reclaims its shape when the haze of politeness clears. The courier arrived just after 10. I handed him the envelopes and gave him the names, the exact instructions. He left quickly, without asking questions. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. The quiet that followed didn't feel like defeat or fear. It felt like a beginning. Upstairs, I heard Clara's voice calling to the children. Doors opened, water ran. A day was starting like any other, but I knew it wouldn't end the same. Back at the table, I cleared the documents, put them neatly back into the box, and returned it to the cabinet where I kept the cookbooks. No one ever looked there. I didn't wait for their reaction. I didn't linger near the front door, hoping to hear footsteps or shouting or footsteps turning back. I returned to my knitting basket, sat in the sunlit corner of the living room, and picked up the scarf I had started weeks ago. My hands moved slowly at first, then steadily, rhythmically. I didn't knit to stay quiet. Not anymore. I knit because I had something worth protecting, and for the first time in a long time, I knew they would have to listen. The courier must have handed her the envelope sometime before noon, because by 12:15, the rhythm of the house changed. I was in the backyard, clipping dead blooms off the rose bushes, when I heard the door open behind me, then slam shut harder than usual. Clara's footsteps moved through the house in sharp, erratic beats, as if she didn't know where she was going but couldn't sit still either. I didn't turn around. I kept trimming, my hands were steady. Inside, a door creaked, drawers opened and closed, the kitchen cabinet, the hallway closet. Footsteps again, then silence, and then her voice. It wasn't loud, not at first. It came like a hiss, a low vibration full of disbelief. I heard my name, followed by words like unbelievable and betrayal. Her voice climbed higher with each breath, the sentences fractured and stumbling. She was talking to herself, pacing, the letter probably still in her hand. I imagined her standing there in the kitchen, envelope torn open like a wound, paper shaking, her mouth open but unable to fully form the outrage into coherent words. I didn't move. I gave her time. Eventually, I came inside. Slowly, not rushing, not avoiding, I walked into the living room just as she stormed past, her eyes wide and disoriented. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something behind the fury. Not just anger, not just insult, but panic. She was unprepared. She hadn't seen it coming. She had believed her version of me so completely that the reality had hit her, like a wall. Mark came home around 4 o'clock. The timing wasn't a coincidence. She must have called him the second she read the letter. When he walked through the door, his face was pale and tight. He didn't take off his jacket. He didn't greet the kids. He asked Clara something quietly, and she handed him the paper like it was radioactive. He read it slowly, his eyebrows twitching with every paragraph. I watched from the hallway, unseen. I didn't hide. I simply stood out of the light, giving them space to absorb the impact. They moved into the dining room. The voices rose, not quite yelling, but close. Her words were jagged and fast, while his were low, weighted, halting. I couldn't make out every sentence, but I knew the shape of the conversation. She was demanding something he couldn't give her. He was trying to explain something she didn't want to understand. She wanted him to fix it. He couldn't. Later that evening, Mark found me in the kitchen. I was peeling apples for a pie I no longer intended to bake. He stood there awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot like a boy about to confess something to a parent. I looked up and waited. No smile, no pretense. He asked why I had done it this way, why I hadn't spoken to him first, why I would do something so formal, so drastic. I told him I had spoken for months in ways he chose not to hear. I reminded him of all the quiet yeses, the silent sacrifices, the times I swallowed my pride and nodded along because I thought that was what mothers did. I reminded him of the day he asked me to move in, not because he needed me, but because I needed him, and how easily that dynamic had flipped the moment I became convenient. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just nodded, eyes low, hands limp at his sides. He looked older in that moment, smaller, like the weight of being in the middle was finally too much. When he left the room, I sat down at the table and folded the apple peels into the compost bowl. My hands moved slowly, almost mechanically. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was something calmer, colder, a return to balance. The rest of the night was oddly quiet. No more outbursts, no slamming doors. Clara didn't come down for dinner. Mark reheated something from the fridge and ate, standing up, barely touching his plate. The children were kept busy with screens and snacks. No one said my name. Before bed, I stood at the foot of the stairs and listened. Their voices floated down in muffled arguments, fragments about ownership, timing, options. I heard my name again. A harsh whisper this time. I returned to my room and closed the door gently. The house around me felt heavier, as if the walls had absorbed the shock and were still ringing from the impact. I sat in bed with my knitting in my lap, but didn't touch it. I watched the shadows drift across the floor and thought about how quickly power shifts when truth is finally spoken. She had told me to knit and stay quiet, and I had, until the moment came when the silence no longer protected me, but her. Now, the silence belonged to them, and the sound they would remember was not my voice. It was the rustle of legal paper, the weight of consequence, and the realization that I had never been powerless, just patient. The house didn't explode after the letter. It crumbled, slowly, like fabric pulled too tightly for too long, fraying at the seams until threads slipped loose and no one could remember where the strength used to be. Everything looked the same from the outside, but inside, nothing fit anymore. Nothing held. Clara stopped speaking to me. At first, it was avoidance. She left the room when I entered. She let the children relay messages. She closed doors just slightly harder than necessary. Then it became something more deliberate. She would walk past me with a look that wasn't quite a glare, but wasn't neutral either. She didn't lash out. No raised voice, no direct accusations. But her silence turned sharp. She wielded it like a blade. Mark was quieter, too. Not with anger, with shame. He moved around the house like a man carrying invisible weights. He tried to pretend everything was normal. He asked how I was sleeping. He thanked me for folding the laundry. He offered me coffee in the mornings. I knew he was trying, but the words landed like apologies without names, and neither of us knew how to bring up what had already been written in black and white. The children noticed. Nora clung to me more than usual. She asked questions with wide eyes and careful tones, sensing tension without understanding its shape. Leo became restless, acting out in small ways as if his body was trying to release what his mind couldn't hold. I softened my voice when I read them stories. I held them longer before bed. I smiled for them even when my chest felt hollow. The letter had done more than shake the balance. It had revealed the truth behind it. We weren't a family. We were a temporary arrangement dressed as permanence. I had been a support beam, not a guest, useful, not loved, expected, not included. I heard them at night, Mark and Clara arguing behind the thin walls, their voices muffled but unmistakable. I heard money mentioned first, then trust, then betrayal, then me. I didn't lean in to listen, but the words came anyway. She blamed him for not telling her. He blamed her for how she treated me. The guilt and defensiveness passed between them like a disease. Neither could hold it for long, so they tossed it back and forth, hoping it would stick to anyone but themselves. She stopped making dinner. Some nights they ordered takeout and ate it upstairs. Other nights they didn't eat together at all. The kitchen became mine again, but it wasn't a gift. It was a retreat. A space that no longer had to pretend. I started spending more time outside. I took long walks around the neighborhood, nodding at strangers, watching the seasons turn quietly along the sidewalks. I visited the library, picked up novels I'd already read, just to hold something familiar. I sat in the park near the old fountain and watched the way birds dipped into puddles and children shouted without restraint. I remembered how good it felt to breathe in a space that wasn't trying to suffocate me with unspoken rules. One evening, I returned home to find Clara in the living room, surrounded by open folders and a laptop glowing with financial spreadsheets. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just kept typing, her jaw tight, her shoulders tense. She looked like someone trying to outwork a deadline that was already behind her. The sight should have made me sad, but it didn't. I watched her for a moment, then went into the kitchen and made myself tea. The water boiled and clicked. The scent of mint rose around me. She never said a word. By the third week, the real conversation started. Between lawyers. I had passed everything through my attorney, and they had done the same. Negotiations were stiff and formal. Clara tried to argue about percentages. Mark tried to compromise. But there were no favors left to give. This wasn't about generosity anymore. It was about clarity. I had given them time, money, and care. In return, they gave me silence, dismissal, and a polite form of exile. The exchange was done. Now it was math. They agreed to the buyout eventually. It would take time, 2 months, maybe 3, but the papers were signed. The terms were clear. I wouldn't stay once it was finalized. I wouldn't linger in this half-life any longer than I had to. The moment the funds cleared, I would leave. I began packing that night. I didn't tell them. I started with my books. Then the framed photos, the small keepsakes from Harold, the knitted blankets I'd made during quieter winters. I folded each piece of my life gently, without resentment. Every item I packed reminded me that I still had a life beyond this house, that this space hadn't erased me, only delayed me. They watched me pack without asking questions. Clara didn't offer help. Mark didn't offer protest. And that was how I knew I had made the right decision. Some things don't fall apart all at once. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, until you're left holding the shape of what once was, and finally, letting it fall. The morning I left, the sky was a soft, pale gray, the kind of sky that promised rain but never followed through. The air in Tacoma had turned cool again, as if the summer had changed its mind and stepped back into spring. I woke before anyone else. I always did. But this time, I didn't move slowly. I didn't linger in bed or sit quietly at the window with my tea. I got dressed with purpose, every motion steady and silent. Most of my things were already packed. The boxes were stacked neatly by the front door, labeled in my careful handwriting. I hadn't needed much help. I hadn't expected it either. Over the last few weeks, the atmosphere in the house had grown thin and distant, like we were all breathing borrowed air and waiting for someone to finally exhale. I walked through the house one last time, barefoot the way I used to when the children were sleeping. I moved room to room without turning on the lights, letting memory guide me. The kitchen still smelled faintly of vanilla and lemon, the remnants of a pie I'd baked 2 nights before without telling anyone. The living room held the same creases in the couch cushions, the same stack of mail no one had bothered to sort. Everything looked ordinary, untouched by conflict, as though the house itself refused to acknowledge the quiet fracture that had split it open. I paused in the hallway where the framed photos lined the wall. Family portraits from holidays and birthdays, professional shots taken in warm light to make everyone look happy. I found one of me holding Nora when she was only a baby. My hair was shorter then. My smile was easy. I wondered how many people in this house remembered who I was in that moment. Back in my room, I closed the last suitcase and zipped it carefully. I didn't feel sad. Not really. What I felt was something deeper, more grounded. Not relief, not triumph. Just completion, a clean end. I had been in this space long enough to offer everything I had and long enough to understand when it was no longer welcome. Mark came down the stairs just as I was pouring my second cup of tea. He looked tired, like someone who'd been sleeping too much or not at all. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, eyes on the boxes. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but whatever it was got stuck somewhere between his throat and his guilt. I didn't speak. I didn't make it easier for him. He asked if I needed help loading the car. I told him no. Everything was handled. He nodded, walked past me to the sink, and turned on the faucet like it was something to do with his hands. I left him there, alone with the sound of running water. Clara didn't come downstairs. I hadn't expected her to. She hadn't looked me in the eye since the papers were signed. Not out of shame, I think, but pride. A pride that had hardened into silence. It was easier for her to ignore me than to admit what she'd done and what she'd lost. The children were still asleep. I'd said my goodbyes the night before. Nora had hugged me so tight it hurt, whispering that she didn't want me to go. I told her gently that grown-ups sometimes need space, just like kids do. She didn't understand, not fully, but she nodded anyway. Leo had clung to my legs in his quiet, stubborn way. I kissed them both on their foreheads and told them they could call me any time. I wasn't sure if they would. I opened the front door just as the moving van pulled into the driveway. A small one, not much to carry. A life condensed into a handful of boxes and a few suitcases. The driver stepped out and offered me a polite smile. I returned it and began helping him load the truck, one item at a time, the way I had packed, carefully, intentionally, without rush. By the time everything was in, the sky had brightened slightly, but the sun still hadn't broken through. I stood at the curb for a moment, one hand on the car door, looking back at the house. There was no one in the windows, no figure at the door, just a stillness that felt final. I didn't cry. I didn't wave. I got in the car and drove away. My new place was small, just 2 rooms and a balcony that overlooked a row of quiet trees. It wasn't far, only 20 minutes away, still in the same city, but it felt like a different world, one where the air didn't feel borrowed, one where the silence wasn't weaponized. That evening, I unpacked slowly. I placed my books on the shelves, hung the photograph of Harold near the window, laid the knit blanket across the arm of the couch. I made a pot of lentil soup and ate at my little table with the window cracked open, letting the cool air in. Later, I sat in my favorite chair and picked up the scarf I'd been knitting. The stitches were tight even. My hands knew exactly where to go. No one interrupted me. No one corrected me. No one told me to sit and stay quiet. I was already sitting, and I had finally chosen the quiet myself. The weeks after I left passed slowly, not in grief or regret, but in the soft unwinding that happens when tension is finally released. I found myself waking up before dawn, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The quiet in my new place wasn't empty. It was restorative. It filled my lungs in a way I hadn't felt in years. There were no footsteps above me, no slammed doors, no conversations spoken in whispers that stopped the moment I entered a room. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of my rocking chair, and the sound of birds beginning to announce the day. I kept to a rhythm. Morning walks through the neighborhood, hot tea with honey and lemon, a book in the afternoon sun by the balcony. I started journaling again, just a few lines each night. Nothing dramatic, just observations, reflections, memories. I wasn't trying to make sense of the past. I was simply giving it a place to rest. Sometimes I thought about them. Mark, Clara, the children. Not with anger, not even with sorrow. Just distance. The kind of distance that grows naturally when you stop holding a door open for people who never intended to come through it with care. I didn't hate them. I didn't wish them harm. I just no longer bent myself to fit into the shape they wanted me to be. One day I received a letter from Nora, a real one. handwritten, with small loops and uneven lines, sealed with a sticker of a sunflower. She told me she missed me. She said the house felt quieter now, but not the good kind of quiet. She asked if I would teach her how to knit next time we were together. I held the letter in my hands for a long time. I ran my fingers over the words, imagined her sitting at the kitchen table with a pen clutched in both hands, trying to say the things no one else could say aloud. I wrote her back that same afternoon. I told her I missed her too. I told her the quiet here was different. It was mine. I promised to teach her how to knit and that it would be just the two of us, no interruptions. I tucked the note into a soft blue envelope and walked it to the mailbox myself. That was enough. I didn't hear from Clara, not a word, but I saw her name once, accidentally on a neighborhood Facebook post, someone asking for recommendations on a contractor, and she had replied with a clipped, cheerful sentence. She still existed in the same world, still moved through it with efficiency, but she no longer took up space in mine. Mark called once, just once. It was a brief conversation, filled with long pauses and unfinished sentences. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He told me the kids were adjusting, that Clara had taken on more hours at work, that the house felt different. I could hear it in his voice, the weight of things unsaid, the apology he couldn't bring himself to form. I didn't press him. I didn't need him to say it. I had already moved past the need for acknowledgement. Some days I thought about how easy it had been for them to believe I would stay quiet forever, as if age softened the spine, as if kindness and obedience were the same thing. They had seen me as something peripheral, but I was never peripheral. I had only stepped back because I was tired, and when I rested long enough, I remembered what it felt like to stand in the center of my own life. I started teaching a knitting class at the local community center on Thursdays. It wasn't much, 6 women in various stages of life, sitting in a circle with yarn and stories. We didn't talk about husbands or children unless we wanted to. We talked about color, texture, rhythm. Some of the women were widows. Some were recently divorced. One of them was barely 30 and said she came just to be near voices that didn't ask her to perform. I understood that. One evening after class, I sat on my balcony and watched the sunset fold over the trees in soft bands of gold and lilac. I thought about all the letters I'd written over the years. Some sent, some burned, some never finished. But this one, the one I had delivered not with stamps but with consequences, that was the only one that ever truly landed. It hadn't been about revenge. It hadn't even been about justice. It had been about truth. And truth, when finally spoken, doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It stands. It waits. And it changes the shape of the room. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The world around me hummed low and steady. I no longer felt like someone waiting for permission. I was no longer holding a place at a table where I wasn't fed. My final word had already been written, and it spoke for itself.